monster lives under my town, and I think I know who it used to be. Last week, she came home. On Tuesday evening, when Tia Greenwood and Matt Walker went missing, the final strands of our threadbare town unraveled. Of course, we've been coming undone for 2 decades, ever since Helen Cavendish ran away at the age of 10. But it wasn't her fault. It wasn't even simply her classmates' fault. Truth be told, all the townsfolk were culpable, in one way or another, and all of us will pay. I tried to get out once. In 2014, I earned my journalism degree from Cambridge. However, by 2020, London had chewed me up. It tried to work me through its steel-lined stomach, but had to spew me out. An oddball from the North Country, no matter how dazzling his credentials, doesn't really belong there. I hardly belonged in Spitheap. That was what my friends and I used to call this place. I have Mr. Fisher, my old German teacher, to thank for that. "Why did you even move here, Wren?" Mrs. Caldwell asked her colleague in the school corridor. He grumbled and shrugged his shoulders. "Heaven knows, Ash. This place is a shit heap. Don't you mean a skice heap?" I loudly chirped behind the chattering teachers, sparking a round of laughter from my friends. The flustered Mr. Fisher, realizing that we had been eavesdropping, then told a blatant lie. "That's not appropriate, Jessie Black." And, "For your information," I said, "Spidipta." The teacher then rewarded me with a demerit and a detention. Things changed last Tuesday, and when they changed all at once. Not dominoes falling one by one, but a house of cards buckling and collapsing. When 3 more townsfolk went missing on Wednesday, people started accusing one another of foul play, accusing neighbors and coworkers they never liked much. Spitheap's Facebook group became a dumpster fire of baseless claims, as nobody knew what was happening. Even the mayor fled to his apartment in the city, sealing Spitheap's dysfunctional state of operations. Hysteria and lies spread. The authorities did nothing to stop that. We're far from civilization out here, far from rules and accountability. Besides, gossip and police officers are synonymous in a small town. They both meander and deal in half-truths. By Friday evening, I'd started to put together an article, not just for the Spitheap paper, but for my blog. I knew I had a limited amount of time before the story became national news, so I wasn't wasting a second of it. I typed as I walked along country lanes from the newspaper's one-room office to my parents' house. Also my house, once again, on the outskirts of town. Dusk was passing, its orange heart swallowed by the sky's black overbite. The snow-capped tops of the alder trees in Spitheap's woodland bled under the glow of the setting sun. For once, I saw not beauty, but a hellscape. There was no comfort from the blistering weather. Instead, I cast my eyes back to my phone and typed with fast-moving digits, skin red and numb from that sub-zero evening. There were pockets of missing information in my draft, of course, so it was far too shallow to go to print. But I'd done my best to fill the gaps. Constable Jordan Merton had a loose tongue, and he let something slip to Alan, a friend of mine, on Friday afternoon. Something that probably should have been kept under wraps. "Merton will kill me when you publish this," Alan pointed out. "Even if he were trying, he wouldn't be able to hurt a fly," I said, and my friend chuckled. "Come on, tell me what he told you." Alan nodded. "He told me that they found something strange in Matt Walker's house. Rope painted white. Filthy, thin, cobweb-coated rope." I frowned. "What?" "I don't know, Jesse," he whispered. "But I think we should get out of town for a bit, you know? Until all of this blows over. 5 people have vanished in 2 days. This killer doesn't seem to be." "Killer?" I loudly interrupted. "We don't know that, Alan. Do you want to hear what else Constable Merton told me?" my friend weakly asked. My skin felt a little clammy as I started to dread what my friend might tell me next. I nodded, nonetheless. "You know Matt lives with his sister, Blair, right?" he asked. "Well, in her interview, she said that she saw something on her drive home, minutes before she found her brother's blood in the house. Something in the road. An animal, but not one she recognized. Not a dog, not a wild fox. Nothing that would make sense in these parts. In any parts. Blair said the thing skittered in stiff, janky movements across the lane. Moved so slowly that she had to swerve. In fact, she said, my friend wore a 1,000-yard stare for several seconds. Then I hoarsely whispered, "What?" She said the thing looked at her, and its face almost seemed human, Alan said. I thought about Blair's version of events as I walked up the darkening tarmac to my parents' home. Jotted down notes of her story that I planned to verify from her own mouth. But I was impatient. I had to write then and there. The prose flowed from my giddy fingers, crushing anything else I'd ever written because this story was my magnum opus. The road beneath my feet wasn't the only thing I ignored. Eventually, however, the smell of burning wood drew my eyes up my phone, and I jolted in panic. Over the trees, about a quarter-mile up the road, rose a billowing, fattening plume of smoke. It was coming from farmer Ryan Gleason's property, which sat only another quarter-mile from my parents' house. I was surprised not to hear sirens, until I remembered that I didn't live in the city anymore. Thinking of my elderly parents just up the road, I pelted forwards, dashing at a pace that hurt my legs and lungs. The smoke didn't help, of course. Still, I kept pushing until the blaze came into view. Gasped when I saw that the house, barn, and all other structures on the property were ablaze. It wasn't the crumbling infrastructure that frightened me. Not even the smoke, full of particles that scorched my lungs lining. It was the driveway painted with streaks of blood that encircled Farmer Gleason's pickup truck. A truck which, given its open doors, had clearly been abandoned. At this point, there finally sounded distant sirens, so I stopped dialing 999. I imagined, even in such an isolated location, that dozens of people must have seen the smoke cloud. Anyhow, I followed the trail of blood to the trees surrounding Gleason Farm. I wasn't sure why the slender trunk stung my teary pupils, but I knew smoke had nothing to do with it. Knew that before the cluster of alders, unhealthily narrow, suddenly shifted sideways. Illuminated by the raging flames, there lurked a nude, muddy, fleshy thing with bent appendages, for long and for short. Though its face was hard to discern through the shade and smoke, the thing undoubtedly watched me. Was undoubtedly, in some sense, human. Blair Walker hadn't been entirely insane. When the creature started to scuttle speedily to the right, disappearing into the forest, I ran up the road in pursuit of it. In a mere half-minute of running later, there came smashes, thuds, and screams from a few hundred yards up the road. But by the time I had reached the driveway of my parents' house, the storm had already passed, had punctured the living room window, leaving jagged shards of glass in the vacant window frame, like uneven teeth. The lounge's overhead light shone brightly, revealing bloodstains across the sofa and the carpet. My parents were gone. I wailed inconsolably as I spun to survey my surroundings, and I immediately noted the disturbed shrubbery beside the driveway. Immediately reminded myself that I'd seen this particular bush in a trampled and forlorn state before. I just blamed a wild animal. I wasn't entirely wrong. Lighting the way with my phone's torch beam, I stepped over the flattened threshold into the woodland. An 100-yard trail of mushed, circular footprints led me to a hovel in the mud. When I shakily shone my light inside, it revealed a curved tunnel that had been burrowed by something far too large to be a badger. Far too large to be anything that came to mind. An animal, but not one she recognized. Not a dog. Not a wild fox. Nothing that would make sense in these parts. In any parts. Alan's words ran through my head as I dropped into the near vertical entrance. And once I'd slipped down the curve, I found myself crouching in a level passageway, slightly wider than the entrance. It needed to be wider to make way for something that made me heave. Propped against the side of the tunnel in a sitting position was a skeleton. It wore faded denim jeans and a rucked, stripy top sinking into the gaps between rib bones. The skull's jaw hung loosely, as if the woman had died screaming. I only really knew for sure that it was a woman because a wooden plank shot from the dirt beside her corpse. Words had been etched into the grooves of the makeshift gravestone. Dr. Beatrice Long, 1975 to 2020. Thank you for making me, but nobody will unmake me. Shuddering uncontrollably, I pressed onwards, and my tightly shut lips finally opened to release a scream. At the end of the tunnel, only 20 yards ahead, was that deformed, 8-limbed thing from the trees. Up close, I saw that its short legs, each a foot in length, weren't legs at all. They were stringy pieces of immovable flesh that seemed only to serve an aesthetic purpose. As for the 4 long appendages, only 2 were legs, the other 2 were arms. And all had been extended to twice the typical length of human limbs. A rounded nub sat at the end of the limbs, other than one arm that still bore a human hand. Kept for practical purposes, perhaps. The torso had been tightened in the middle, reshaping the midsection into 2 bumpy ovals, and the face bore 2 additional eyes, again, only serving an aesthetic purpose. But the mouth was the most horrid. It had been surgically altered to feature sideways lips, and all human teeth had been removed. Instead, there protruded 2 chiseled fangs made from a dull stone coated in blood. The creature was clearer now. She was clearer. Helen? I blubbered. She did not say a word. Could not say a word, as she had removed her tongue. But I recognized those eyes. Recognized something in that mutilated face. It was Helen Cavendish. After she'd observed me with a tilted head, while swaying on her long legs, the creature grunted gutturally and backed away, skittering in reverse on those 4 monstrous limbs, the shorter ones bouncing uselessly from the sides of her bumpy, segmented torso. Helen slipped into the shadows, beyond the reach of my torch beam, and something told me that I shouldn't follow, that I wouldn't like what I'd find. I pushed forwards anyway, and there, amongst the mutilated corpses of townsfolk, were the still twitching bodies of my mother and father. I whined animalistically as Helen opened her lopsided mouth and plunged her stone fangs into the crown of my mother's head. My father, lying beside her on a bloody mound of corpses, dozily twisted his head to face the spectacle. Twisted to watch Helen feast on his wife, but managed only to mumble something incomprehensible. However, I only truly registered one thing. The back of Dad's head was gone. Helen had taken a clump of his hair, skin, skull, and gray matter. I whimpered as he started to fade. Then I turned my attention to my mother. Her near-knowing eyes gazed upon me, fighting to recognize her only son. She was still alive in some halfway. Flesh in the great tower, Mum groaned loosely. Eyes started to roll into the back of her head. What remained of it? Stop! I screamed at the monster digesting chunks of my mother's brain. The spider stopped mid-munch, then shot its head towards me with a lightning reflex, with eyes that had forgotten their humanity. This wasn't the friend I'd lost at the age of 10, and it was clear that I wasn't her friend either. I spun, bumping my head on the hard dirt of the tunnel ceiling, and hurried back up the tunnel's curve as nubby limbs near soundlessly followed me. The soft thumps of those rounded skin paws reverberated off the tunnel walls as I scrambled up the vertical entrance. I emerged from that nightmarish underworld, lungs filling with smoke from the forest, then followed the muddy tracks back to the driveway. And as I scurried across the dirt, hunted by my feral once friend, I set my sights on the Hyundai ahead. But when my shoe soles hit the tarmac and freedom hit my tongue, there came the grip of something against my nape. Not a rounded nub, but emaciated fingers. I screamed and tripped into the driver's door of my waiting car, thumping my head against the metal and crumpling to the ground. There she stood, illuminated by the exterior motion lighting. Helen Cavendish, an 8-legged abomination. Far from a spider, though I wouldn't have dreamt of telling her that. A vengeful spirit that had returned, after 21 years, to hunt those who had ridiculed her. Even my own dear parents, who had merely chuckled playfully when Helen confessed her dream of becoming an arachnid. I was slouching, dazed and confused, against the side of my car, not even bothering to search for my keys, as all seemed to be lost. The spider creature's remaining human hand reached its probing, dancing fingers towards me. Dirty, overgrown nails scraped painfully through my brunette hair, cutting through flesh towards the back of my head. They drew blood, then eventually found purchase in the part of my crown that would, soon enough, be Helen's meal. By some miracle, however, the distant sirens grew not so distant at all, and I realized that the smoke filling my lungs had come from close flames. The inferno had spread from Gleason's farm to my parents' property, much like the firefighters. Those vibrant lights and sounds clearly spooked the horrifying creature as its nails suddenly lifted from my skin. By the time the responders found me, shivering on the driveway, the creature had fled. I know I should do the same, but I won't. Won't let my parents' deaths mean nothing. The hovel's empty now. I showed the detectives, and they're following it up, but their incompetence knows no bounds. 10 more townsfolk have gone missing. It doesn't matter who laughed and who didn't. After all, I always supported her dream, but that thing didn't care because it's not Helen. Not anymore.